Today we're in John chapter 19, verses 1 through 16. You can be turning in your Bible to John chapter 19, verses 1 to 16. Study sheets are still being passed around if you'd like to pick one up. This is really the continuation of the Roman trial. You remember in the middle of the night there was a Jewish trial, first at Annas' house, then it was transferred to Caiaphas' house. All that was done in the middle of the night so that they could then present actual charges before Pilate, who had the authority to put Jesus to death. And this is the Roman trial. And so this Roman trial began right at the beginning of the morning. Pretty much as soon as the sun came up, we're through the night, sun comes up, Jesus is delivered to Pilate. And we talked a little bit about it last week, starting in chapter 18, verse 28. And now this, this is the continuation. And you remember that there's the scene shifts back and forth between inside and outside because Jesus' accusers will not come inside so that they would still be able to eat the Passover, and yet Jesus is inside where the trial is. So Pilate is having to go from inside where he can talk to Jesus to outside where he can talk to his accusers, and you'll see how things keep going back and forth. Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him, and the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" and struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you so that you may know that I find no guilt in him." So Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die, because he has made himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "You will not speak to me. Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, and in Aramaic, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, "Behold, your king." They cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So he delivered him over to them to be crucified. Now what I'd like to do this morning is the way that I've been sort of walking through these last couple chapters. I want to make sure that we understand everything that's going on, so we'll kind of go through verse by verse or paragraph by paragraph, and then I'll conclude by having a few application points at the end. So let's look back at the passage, starting in verse 1. It says, "Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him." So Pilate had Jesus flogged. Now there's something we need to understand about Roman flogging. There were three ways that a prisoner or someone who was in the cuffs of justice could be flogged according by the Romans. There was sort of the entry-level one, which was just a good old-fashioned beating. There was another one that was really kind of punitive, but they would then be released. But then the third and final one, the worst one, was when you were sentenced to death. They would flog you to kind of prepare you to die, so that you would kind of be pushed down the road. What's going on here in verse 1 is the first kind of flogging. It's just really a beating. That Pilate just wanted to assert his authority over Jesus, and he just had him beaten. Now we know that Jesus would be flogged again. This was not the last flogging of Jesus, because Jesus would be flogged again after the death sentence with the worst kind of flogging. And it was then that Jesus suffered at the cat of nine tails and the worst kind of flogging that the Romans could inflict upon him. The reason Pilate did this one was probably to appease Jesus' accusers. Just to say, "Look, you brought him to me. You said he's a bad guy. I've beaten him up a little bit. Now take him back. He's good. I don't find any charge with him." Because we're going to notice Pilate is going to do everything that he can think of to try to get out of this. And this is just one other way in which he's trying to do it. He flogs Jesus with the least severe kind of flogging, in a sense to appease the accusers and say, I've done what he deserves and what you brought him to me to do. There's nothing left for me to do. Verse number 2. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. Now Jesus is being humiliated. You'll have to remember that the charge the accusers bring to Pilate, the first one is basically a non-charge. They say, look, if he weren't a bad guy, we wouldn't have brought him to you, which is basically a non-charge. But ultimately what they're going to say is he's claiming that he's the king of the Jews. And so what Pilate is going to do is humiliate him in such a way and present him, humiliate him and then present him to the people, so that when people see Jesus, he would be in no shape or in no form ever to be followed as king again, ever, right? Like, Pilate is wanting to create a scene in which the impression is made that Jesus is not a king, nor will he ever be a king. Because no one who ever is going to be humiliated like this guy is ever going to be able to get enough people around him to say, oh yeah, he's a king, we're going to follow him. And so that's what this humiliation is about. Jesus has already been humiliated at the high priest's house. Right? So he's already been beaten up a little bit. Pilate has him beaten again. And then they create a crown of thorns. And you'll know that kings or emperors in those days wore crowns. They weren't crowns like we often think of a crown, in that we often think of jewels in a crown, gems in a crown. But the crowns in those days were often of living things, like laurel plants or bushes or things like this. And so Jesus also is wearing a crown. They form a crown for him in the mold of a crown that people would have worn then. Caesar, he would have had a crown of, I think it would have been a laurel crown, but anyway, something living, and he would have worn it as a sign of honor. So they make Jesus also a crown in the same kind of form and fashion, but it's a crown of thorns. So saying, oh yeah, this is a king, but he doesn't wear the nice, green, living sign of honor. He wears one that's a crown of thorns. And the word for thorn here is just a generic word for thorn, and as you know, there's all kinds of different thorns. But this could have just been a thorn that was very small and meant to humiliate him, but it also could have been a thorn that was up to 12 inches long. So not simply meant to be like, oh, look at this guy, he's a fool, claiming to be a king, but also meant to inflict pain, and that they could have really pressed it into his head. I think it is significant that Jesus is wearing a crown of thorns, because John has been highlighting those points in which Jesus is being cursed for us, that Jesus is bearing our curse, the curse that is due us, right? You remember that Jesus' accusers would not go in to the Praetorium, the Roman city hall in Jerusalem, because they didn't want to become unclean. But guess who went into the Praetorium and thus became unclean? Jesus. That Jesus bore that curse of uncleanness, right? And what is the wages of sin? What's the curse for sin? It's death, and Jesus is going to bear that curse too. Jesus is going to be separated from his Father, because that's a part of the curse of sin, right? Because when Adam and Eve sinned, they were then cast out of the garden, they were exiled, they were separated from God, and Jesus is going to experience that curse too. But think back with me to Genesis 3. That's the chapter in which Adam and Eve sin. They obey the authority of creation. They obey the authority of the serpent. And they sin. And they're found out and they're caught. And then God pronounces a curse. And what is a part of the curse in Genesis 3? And he said, the Lord said to the man specifically, you're going to earn your living. You're going to earn your food. You're going to gain food by the sweat of your brow. But the earth is going to produce what? Thorns and thistles. That's a part of the curse. And Jesus here is wearing a cursed crown. He's wearing a crown. He is crowned king with the curse. He's crowned king with the thorns. And so Jesus here is bearing the curse for us, a crown of thorns. And he's carrying all of this curse with him to the cross, where he will continually be cursed. Because cursed is every man who hangs on a tree. The wages of sin is death. He bears that curse. He's separated from God. John is highlighting all of these things, that Jesus is bearing the curse on our behalf. It says they put him in a purple robe. Obviously, this would not have been fitted to him. Most likely, the robe that would have been given to him was the one that was least well-fitted, right? So if Jesus was a tall man, they would have given him the short man's robe. If Jesus was a short guy, they would have given him the tall man's robe. They want to make him look foolish. And so they give him a purple robe, and the reason purple was a royal color was because it was the most expensive to produce. The ability to produce a purple color in clothing in those days was extremely hard. And so because it was very rare, it became the symbol of royalty, the color of royalty. But anyway, they present him and array him, it says, in this purple robe. Verse 3 says, they came up to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and struck him with their hands. The way that the emperor, if he were ever out and about, would have been applauded was, or acclaimed, would have been by saying, "Hail Caesar. Hail, it's the king. Hail the king." And so here they're mocking Jesus by saying basically the same thing. They're so, "Hail, here's the king. Look at the king. He's got a crown. He's got on purple robes." And so they're just mocking him. And it says they were hitting him. Okay? Now what we need to understand about the way that this sentence is structured is that it doesn't just say they hit him once, but it says in the Greek, what it's communicating is that they were continually hitting him. So it wasn't like they said, "Hail, King of the Jews," and then hit him once and then that was over. They were probably hitting him before that. They were saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." They continued to hit him, and then they continued to hit him even after that. So it was a continual kind of force. Verses 4 through 7. Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no guilt in him." So this is Pilate trying to get out of it again. He's like, "Look, he claims to be a king. You guys are telling me he's a king. He is not a king." By this time, his eyes are probably swollen shut. His face is at least red, probably purple from the bruises. He's wearing an ill-fitted robe. He's got on his crown of thorns. Pilate is trying to say, there's no way anyone would ever follow this guy. So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." The Jews answered him, We have a law, and according to the law he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God." Pilate is once again trying to hand Jesus back over to his accusers. And when he presents him, he says, "Behold the man." And that phrase, during this period, during the Roman period, when someone would say, "Behold the man," it's almost a way of saying, "Behold this pitiful creature. Behold this poor fellow." In other words, he's saying, this guy's, he's a nobody. He's humiliated. What else do you want us to do to the guy? He inspires no leadership. He's to be pitied. And Pilate is trying to persuade Jesus' accusers that he is no threat, that Jesus is no threat, because he has been publicly shamed and humiliated. But Jesus' accusers are unrelenting. Verse 8. When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. Now, the statement that Pilate heard that made him afraid was when they said, "He claims even to be Son of God." And that struck me this week as I was preparing this message. Why would Pilate become even more afraid? Right? That tells us something. That tells us that Pilate was already a little bit uneasy about all of this. And we can tell that based on how he's interacting here, right? He's really trying to get out of this. He doesn't want to bear the culpability and responsibility that he's been given here, because I think it's clear he feels very uneasy about what's going on. But then when they claim, he even claims to be the Son of God, it says Pilate became even more afraid. And I think this is further confirmation to Pilate that what is going on here is a sham and that Jesus is not to be touched. We know from another gospel, Pilate's wife had already come to him saying, "I've had a dream about this guy, I have nothing to do with him." So that conversation has already taken place, and now his accusers come and say he's even claimed to be the Son of God, and this catches Pilate's attention in a very significant way, and it says he became even more afraid. And I believe Pilate becomes afraid, even more afraid, because he can tell that there is something different about Jesus. Verse 9. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate's question here is one of the most important in all of the book of John. As we've gone through this book, we've seen countless times in which Jesus' origin is the point at question. Where is Jesus from? That's the question that the book of John is seeking to answer. And so Pilate, he gets it. He's understanding that there's something different about Jesus, and so he comes to Jesus with the question that the book of John, the entire book, is trying to answer. Where are you from? And you'll know that Jesus' followers are the ones who recognize that he is not from here alone, but that he has come from above. He has been sent from the Father. He is the heavenly man. He is the God man. He is God who has taken on flesh. But Jesus' accusers always are saying, "Oh, you're from Beelzebub. You're from the devil. You're from Satan. You're from below." And so we see in the Gospel of John not only this emphasis on the question of where Jesus is from, but we see that it actually becomes the dividing line between believers and unbelievers. Where do you believe Jesus came from? That will divide you into the two camps in the Gospel of John, and I think the same is true today. That is the most important question you can answer about Jesus. Not was he a great teacher? I think everybody would agree Jesus was a great teacher. Not was he a good man? I think most people would agree upon that. That's not what separates faith from unbelief. It's where did he come from? Because if you believe that Jesus is the Son of God, and if you believe that he has come from the Father, sent from the Father, with a heavenly message, that he is God in the flesh, well then he's even more than a great teacher. He is communicating the very Word of God. And if you believe that he's come from God, then his death is not just a tragic martyr's death, which there are many of those in the world's history. And so we as Christians are not simply elevating one martyr's death among other martyrs' deaths. And we're just picking one martyr's death and saying this one's more important. We're saying this one's more important because he is more important. Because he's not just like these other people who died for causes. He's the one who's come from heaven. That makes his death that much more valuable. It makes it of infinite value. The resurrection for us is not just some trick that some guy did or some disciples, kind of came up with this on the fly and were like, let's see, what can we say about Jesus? Let's say he was raised from the dead. We believe it actually could happen because of where he comes from. So Pilate's question, it gets right to the heart of the issue, but Jesus, it says, doesn't answer. Verse 10. So Pilate said to him, "You will not speak to me. Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" Jesus doesn't answer because he's not going to plead his case before Pilate. If Pilate wanted evidence of where he was from, that evidence had been given many times before. Pilate's not going to be convinced in this moment. In fact, Jesus knew where all this was headed. So Jesus has already stated where he's from. That's the previous chapters. They've already had this conversation. And if Pilate didn't know already, then no amount of explaining would have convinced him. Jesus is not going to beg for his life. That's not what this is about. I mean, and really this is what Pilate wants. Pilate, because that's what he asserts in verse 10. He's like, "You're not going to answer me? Don't you know I can put you to death? Don't you know you should be pleading for your life right now? Don't you know that you should be on hands and knees, groveling at my feet, bringing up every reason why I shouldn't kill you? Even making things up, Jesus, come on. Be self-respecting a little bit." So irritated, Pilate asserts his authority. Now let's look at verse 11. Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." I love that exchange. That's such a powerful exchange between Jesus and Pilate right there. Pilate comes to Jesus and he says, Jesus, don't you know what's going on? Don't you know that I have authority over you? And Jesus responds by saying, you don't have authority over me. Any authority that you have has been given to you from above. And then notice what Jesus does in verse 11. Jesus judges Pilate. Who's the judge here? The tables totally got reversed. Pilate has yet to pronounce judgment on Jesus. Everything Pilate has said up to this point is, hey, take him back. I don't see any charge with him. I don't like this. This is 3 times up until this point. Pilate has clearly stated, I find nothing wrong with him. He has said that 3 times. Chapter 19, verse 4, chapter 19, verse 6, and in chapter 18, verse 38, he specifically states, I find nothing wrong with this man. So Pilate has yet to pronounce judgment against Jesus, but here in verse 11, Jesus pronounces judgment against Pilate. Pilate says, don't you know I have authority over you? And Jesus responds by saying, look, all the authority that you have has been given to you from above. And that's why the sin you're committing, you notice how Jesus is judging him right now? Jesus is saying, that's why the sin you're committing is not as bad as the sin that's been committed from the one handing me to you. So Jesus is judging. He's saying, Pilate, you're a sinner. You're sinning right now. This is not right. But it's not as bad as the sin of those who handed you to me. And handed me to you. Right? So Jesus totally flips the chairs there. He asserts his own authority and sits on the seat of judgment. Verse 12. From then on, Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, if you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. So Pilate again is seeking to release Jesus, but the accusers now play their trump card, which is Pilate's vulnerability in Rome. You remember, last week we talked about Pilate. Pilate had been appointed to this position by a very influential man in the Roman imperial guard. So this man had a lot of influence in Rome, and he is the one who specifically appointed Pilate to this position. He's the one who recommended him for the job. He's the one who represented Pilate's interests in Rome. But this man had passed away by this time. So Pilate is very vulnerable. His position, his standing, his job is vulnerable, and so they play their trump card, and they say, well, if this doesn't go our way, Pilate, we're going to take it to Rome. Verse 13, so when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement in an Aramaic Gabbatha. At this point, Pilate sits in the official seat from which judgment was passed, the judgment seat. And he officially casts judgment that Jesus is worthy of condemnation, that Jesus is worthy of the death penalty. And then 14 to 16. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, behold, your king. They cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. So he delivered him over to them to be crucified. Pilate sarcastically mocks Jesus' accusers, but yet he delivers him to be crucified. Now, ever since Jesus has been arrested, there's been a lot of irony. John has highlighted the irony that's going on in all these events. And so again, in this passage, we see irony again, and I want to point out at least 3 instances of it. The first one is that the judge is judged. I've already pointed that out. That Pilate's the judge, and yet he's judged. Jesus is the one judging him. Jesus is the one asserting his authority over him. Jesus is pronouncing spiritual judgment. He's saying, Pilate, what you're doing is a sin, but it's not as much of a sin as the ones who handed me over to you. Number 2, flip side of that irony is that the judge is judged. We sang already that Jesus is going to come again, and he's going to judge the living and the dead. That is part of the responsibility. That's part of the honor that has been given to the Son of God, Jesus, by the Father, that he is going to be judged. And yet who's the one sitting at the foot of the judgment seat, receiving judgment in this passage? judge is judged, one day these positions will be reversed. On this day, Pilate sat in the judgment seat and pronounced judgment on Jesus, saying he is worthy of condemnation, he is worthy of death. But one day, it will not be Jesus who's at the foot of the seat and Pilate who's sitting on it. It will be Jesus who's sitting on the seat and Pilate who's at the foot of it. And Pilate will have to give an accounting for his actions, as will all of us in this room. And then the final piece of irony is that Pilate is really trying to draw out this accusation that Jesus is king, and he's trying to show how foolish it is. This guy is not a king. He inspires no loyalty. He has no followers. He's humiliated. And so the irony is that the king is bloody and beaten. And Pilate speaks better than he knows. John's really good about that too. John's really good about highlighting when people speak better than they know. Remember what Caiaphas said, that it's better for one man to die than for the whole nation to die? And John even notes, he puts in parentheses, it's like Caiaphas didn't even know what he was saying. Because it's so true. It's better for one man to die than for all the people to die. And that's the gospel. And Pilate here speaks better than he knows because he presents a bloody, beaten, humiliated, abandoned, and rejected Jesus with a crown of thorns and an ill-fitting purple robe. And he says, "Behold." Now the 2 points that I'd like to focus on for application are, first of all, between two worlds. And we've talked about this since chapter 18. And we're going to keep talking about it as long as it is a point in the passage. But starting in chapter 18, we've really seen how we live between two worlds. How Jesus represents a kingdom that is not of this world, and yet we live in this world. Jesus lived in this world. Jesus faced judgment in this world. Jesus was beaten in this world. But Jesus is clear, my kingdom is not of this world. So there's two worlds. And here we are today, you and I are living in this world, and we have jobs in this world, and we pay bills in this world, and we have homes in this world, and we have cars in this world, and we have pressures and anxieties in this world. But yet we know that there's another world. And our loyalty and our allegiance is there. And so how do we live between these two worlds? And it's in these chapters, especially in chapters 18 and 19 of John, that he's really drawing out the difference and the distinction between the two. This passage again highlights the difference between the kingdom of this world and the kingdom that is not of this world. Now last week we had a point that was very similar. And you may have left last week thinking, well, Michael, I'm glad you're encouraging us to live for the world that's not, the kingdom that's not of this world, and you're telling us not to live for the kingdom that is this world. Michael, could you give us some more concrete illustration of what that looks like? Why can't you, Michael, make it clear? Well, the reason is because I knew that there was this week. This passage is the illustration. You have two chief characters in this passage. And they represent more than simply themselves in this passage. One represents how to live for the kingdom that's not of this world. And the other represents how to live for the kingdom that is of this world. Pilate is the embodiment of living for this world. He is the illustration. What does it mean to live for this world? Look at everything Pilate does. That's what it means. What does it mean to not live as if this world is all that there is? Look at Jesus. That's what it means. That's how you live. I want us to notice that Jesus resigns every right that he has in this life. And that's what it means to live for the kingdom that's not of this world, is that you are willing to resign every right that you have in this life and in this world. You're willing to give it all up because you know that there's a better place, that there's a more real place, a place that's even more real than this. Did Jesus have a right to flee the people who came to arrest him? Yes. Did Jesus have a right to a fair trial? Yes. Does Jesus have a right to live? Absolutely. He's innocent. But do you see Jesus pleading for any of these things? You see Jesus, arguing technicalities in the courtroom. Hey, this isn't a fair trial. Annas, I shouldn't even be in your courtyard. Why am I here? I'm going to get a lawyer. And in that passage, in that moment where Pilate is like, look, Jesus, maybe you don't understand what's going on here. I have the authority to put you to death. And I've been in this position a lot, and people don't act like you're acting. People are at my feet squeezing them, bawling, got their families, they're freaking out. And Jesus, you're just sitting here not saying a word. Because Jesus had resigned his right even to live. He'd given up everything. And that's such a significant statement in the previous chapter where Jesus reminds Pilate, he said, listen, if my kingdom were of this world, we'd all be acting a lot differently. But it's not. And that's why we act the way that we do. That's why we didn't flee. That's why my disciples didn't fight. That's why I'm here. And ultimately, that's why he would stand before Pilate and not say a word. He doesn't have to defend himself. He's willing to give up his everything. Money will be of no consequence to Jesus in 3 days. His life even, he's willing to lay it all down. Now let's flip the script. Let's look at Pilate. How's Pilate acting? Pilate is not willing to give up anything in this world. The text makes very clear Pilate is sympathetic toward Jesus. Pilate thinks that Jesus is innocent. In fact, I would go so far to say the text is even pretty clear that Pilate has some beliefs about Jesus. He has some convictions about Jesus. That Jesus, something different is going on. And it might have been the accumulation of everything. It might have been his wife saying, hey, I had a dream about him, don't have anything to do with him. It might have been the way that Jesus was responding. But all of these things are coming together so that Pilate has these convictions. He is obviously drawn to Jesus. And I've already said 3 different times he declares Jesus innocent. And yet, he delivers him to be crucified. And yet, he is the one who ultimately passes the death sentence. Jesus doesn't die on a cross that day unless Pilate sits in his judgment seat and says, this man is worthy of death. This man, who I'm sympathetic toward, who I think is pretty different, in whom I see something more powerful going on in him than I see in anybody else, this man is worthy of death. Now, why would Pilate do that? When was Pilate's decision made? Like, when did he actually do it? It's when they say, hey, if you don't do this, we'll go to Rome. Jesus was willing to give up everything, every right that he had in his life for what he believed. Pilate wasn't willing to give up anything in this life for what he believed. Pilate's a coward because he won't risk anything. He wouldn't even risk his job. The truth is, he may have lost his job. Maybe. But he's not even willing to risk it. Now you have to understand, being governor of Judea is a great job. It's a great gig. He made great money. He had awesome benefits. He'd never, ever be able to attain that position again if he were to lose it and be shamed in it. So it wasn't like it was something small, but yet he's not willing to even risk losing it for Jesus. His convictions about Jesus did not lead him to risk any of his worldly attainments, and that is not biblical faith. Convictions and even beliefs do not constitute biblical faith. You can be worldly like Pilate and have all the beliefs and all the convictions that you want about Jesus. The question is, what are you willing to risk? What are you willing to sacrifice? What are you willing to give up? And that demonstrates your faith. You remember James says, oh, you believe Jesus is the Son of God? Well, so do the demons. You believe there's one God? So do the demons. Demons have good beliefs. Demons have good convictions. Pilate here has good convictions. Pilate liked Jesus. Jesus was Pilate's homeboy. But was Pilate willing to risk anything? The answer is no. Nothing. So because of that, he has no faith. There are important questions that each of us must answer in this life. And I sure hope that your career, that your standing, your position, your parents, your cousins, your children would never hinder you from honestly answering these questions. But I'm afraid so often it's exactly those things that get in the way from us honestly answering these questions. And even truly living out our convictions about them. Maybe we've already answered them. Maybe we truly do believe Jesus is the only way to know God, but we'd never say that because we'd be ostracized from our family. We'd never say that because that would make us the oddball at work. We'd never say that because maybe we would lose our job. Maybe we wouldn't be promoted. Pilate's ultimate allegiance is demonstrated by his behavior. And Pilate chose to condemn Jesus. And Jesus, on the other hand's allegiance is demonstrated by his behavior. So, my friends, our faith truly is manifest by our works. True biblical faith is manifest. It's made plain, it's made clear, it's revealed by what we are willing to risk, what we are willing to give up. And Jesus makes it abundantly clear, you must be ready to risk everything. That's the price. You must be willing and ready to give up everything in this life to gain true and eternal life. Second and finally, Jesus is King. And this was his coronation. King Jesus has been crowned on this earth. And this was his coronation. Now, I've had the privilege of being at the Tower of London in London. And one of the exhibits in the Tower of London is the crown jewels. And you can go and you can look at these jewels. And there are jewels that the Queen wears on a daily basis, like necklaces and rings and bracelets and things like this. She may even wear like a really small crown, but there are certain jewels in the collection that are only worn one time. And these jewels are so big that when we talk about the gems in these things, we don't just say those are diamonds. These gems are so big they have names. Like, that's not just a diamond, that's the star of Africa. Like, that's how big these diamonds are, okay? And these jewels are called the regalia. And the regalia is only worn one time in their lives. And you know what time that is? It's the coronation. That's when they wear the huge crown with the Star of Africa. That's when they carry the big scepter, the golden scepter, with all the jewels. They don't wear, they don't run around Buckingham Palace with this stuff every day. They wear it one time when they're crowned, when there's the coronation, to assert authority, to reveal majesty. Say, this is our queen, this is our king, look how beautiful this is. That's how kings in this world and queens in this world are crowned. But Jesus' kingdom is not of this world. And this is how our king is crowned. With the crown of thorns, beaten, bloodied, abandoned, with the ill-fitting robe. Any false pretenses we might have that Jesus' kingdom is of this world are undermined by Pilate's presentation of Jesus as king. Like, I seriously don't know how you can finish John chapter 19, verse 16, and say, oh yeah, I think Jesus' kingdom is of this world. If you were holding out hope that God's going to give you a Rolls Royce because all your hope is in this world, I think it's ended by this chapter. If you're hoping that God's going to make your life perfect because this life is all that there is, and that Jesus is just here to make this life better for you, I just don't see how you can say that by the end of this passage. If you were holding out hope for it, I think it's pretty squarely squashed. Because this is how Jesus is crowned king. You know, at one level, the presentation of Jesus as king is pathetic. From the perspective of this world, it's pathetic. There's no Star of Africa. There's no golden scepter. But at another level, the spiritual level, it's beautiful. And it's riveting. It fits so perfectly with everything that Jesus has taught us until now. Would you expect anything different from the incarnate one? Would you expect anything different from the one who's left all of the privileges of heaven to take on flesh? I mean, that's already just a massive amount of humbling and humiliation. I mean, he got tired. And yet here, he's going to be crowned king. Would you expect anything different? As I read the scripture, I am not surprised that Jesus is presented as king in this way. I don't think Jesus would have stopped the proceedings and said, hey, wait, this is all going so horribly wrong. I'm so misunderstood. I am a king, but you've got it all mixed up. This isn't right. Things aren't going the way that they should be. We know from Scripture that it says everything was happening according to plan. So even this was part of the plan. The humiliating presentation of Jesus as king was part of the plan. Why? Because Jesus is king, but his kingdom is not of this world. Now you remember, the part of Pilate's plan, or part of Pilate's purpose in doing all these things to Jesus was to put him in such a place, to make such a mockery of him, that no one would ever follow him as king. You see how the first shall be last and the last shall be first, and how everything gets mixed up, how everything gets turned around when it comes to God's kingdom? I think he's king. Didn't work for me. See your king? You look at him and you say, I'll follow that guy. That's my leader. That's my Lord. World, you can have the jeweled ones. You can have the robed ones. We'll take the beaten one. We'll follow the one who's rejected and given up everything. The one who's abandoned. That's what we'll follow. And that's ultimately what it comes down to for us. And the truth is, if that's how they crown our king, what should the followers of that king expect? Different treatment? I mean, if that's how our king is crowned, if that's like the pinnacle, when he's just presented to the world as king finally, how should we expect to be treated? What should our expectation be? What should our expectation level be of life in this world? I think we have to be willing to follow him. We have to be willing to follow him to a place where we are willing to give up everything in this life. Even if it costs us absolutely everything, we're willing to give it up. Because of what we believe. Because we believe that there is a kingdom that's not of this world, and that kingdom is so much greater. Now the truth is, we live between two worlds. I get it. You're going to have to get dressed up. You're going to have to try to impress people. I get it. That's part of living in this world. We should be familiar with how to do it. Like I said, Jesus praises people who are worldly wise, who understand how to operate in this world. He praises people like that. So we should be familiar with both worlds. But we should not despise the humiliation and shame that our King experienced either. Yes, we might get cleaned up and dressed up to gain an audience with the leading lights of our day, but we should be most at home when identifying with our humble and rejected King. Let's pray together.